The island of Barbados was simply too crowded. Englishmen had been coming to the island for several years, building plantation, growing sugar and other cash crops. The plantations had gotten larger and larger, but you can't go in any direction on an island without coming to water very quickly. They'd simply run out of land. They needed more land. They were getting rich and they wanted to get richer. Some of the people who lived on Barbados said that perhaps they should start a new colony on the mainland in the New World. They were still calling it the New World, even though Christopher Columbus had discovered North America a good number of years ago. There was plenty of land, and there were other colonies there. Why, everybody had heard of Jamestown, Virginia, and well south of there, the Spanish had St. Augustine, Florida. Surely, in between those two colonies, they would find plenty of land for spreading out just as far as you would care to go. Those colonies, their names sounded so romantic. Virginia, named for a rich and powerful virgin queen. Florida, the land of flowers. But in truth, life in the New World was not without its perils. People had tried to settle in the area between Virginia and Florida and had died from starvation, or they had been attacked by hostile Indian tribes. It was finally decided that a ship should go and explore the coast and see if there was a good place for starting a colony. And so a Captain Sanford got together a crew and they sailed off for the New World. And it wasn't long before the crew found a natural little harbor that on early maps was called Port Royal. And in that place, just upriver from the harbor, there was a friendly Indian tribe. The Englishmen aboard that ship called them the Port Royal Indians. Later they would be known as the Cusabo. It was decided that it would be best if someone could live among the Cusabo Indians for a while and learn about their life there. The Indians would have plenty of knowledge that would be very helpful to the Englishmen when they built the colony. What type of crops would grow well, where the most fertile soil was located. They could show them all the deep water rivers that would be useful for a shipping and trading industry. A young doctor, Dr. Henry Woodward, who was a surgeon aboard the vessel, volunteered to stay among the Cusabo Indians. Speaking with a translator, when the Indians realized that one of the Englishmen was actually going to stay there and live among them, they were very, very excited. Other people had visited on that part of the coast and had done some trading with the Cusabo, but no one had ever lived with them, and they were very pleased about that fact. In fact, the chief of the Cusabo immediately adopted Henry Woodward as his own family member and gave him a grand tour of the village. It really wasn't much of a village. There were just some houses gathered in a circle. They were all made out of bent-over saplings covered over in palmetto fronds. Every house looked just the same. There was a little door. The tall Englishman had to stoop down to get through the small opening. And in the top of each house, there was a big hole where smoke from the cooking fires could go up and out. And then after they'd looked at all of the houses, the chief pointed to a particular home and told Dr. Woodward through an interpreter that this would be his house. This would be where he would live. And then they walked beyond the village, and the chief showed Dr. Woodward a lot of different fields filled with corn. He pointed to a particular location, and he said that that would be Dr. Woodward's field, and he could grow corn or anything else he chose to grow. And then the chief said that he had one more final gift for his newest family member. He motioned for all the Englishmen to follow him, and behind the Englishmen trailed along several Indian braves and their wives and children from the village. They went to a house that was right in the middle of the little Indian town, much larger than all the other huts. This was the house of meeting, where Indian braves would gather and tell tales and smoke their pipes and play games and practice shooting their bows and arrows. The chief walked into the house of meeting, and all the Englishmen followed him, and then the Indians crowded in behind them. It was very hot and stuffy inside. There was a ceremonial fire burning in a pit in the middle of the floor with benches all around. Everyone took seats, and the chief sat down on a tall bench at one end of the room. This was kind of his throne. He motioned for Dr. Woodward to come and sit on his right side. And then he motioned for a young girl, a girl that was actually his niece, to come and sit on his left side. When everyone was seated and the crowd had grown quiet, the chief took Dr. Woodward by the hand, and he took the young girl by the hand, and he clapped their hands together. He raised their hands overhead, And he said a few words. Nobody bothered to interpret, so Dr. Woodward had no way of knowing, but he had just gotten married. The chief had given his niece hand in marriage to his new English brother. As soon as the Indians saw the marriage ceremony, they all started to sing, and then they went outside and there were dances. And then the Englishmen climbed aboard their ship and sailed back to Barbados. And Dr. Henry Woodward started his new life among the Cusabo. His wife's name was Tukeluke. That was hard for Dr. Woodward to say, so he ended up shortening her name to Tuke. And she called him White Husband most of the time. And Tuke turned out to be a very good teacher for Henry. One of the first things he wanted to know was how to get rid of the mosquitoes and the bugs. The Indians were friendly, but the bugs were savage. They would bite any skin that was exposed. Mr. Woodward had welts all up and down his arms that would itch, and then when he scratched them too hard, they would bleed. He had bites on his face and the back of his neck. But he noticed that the Indian people, they never seemed to complain about bugs. They wore practically nothing. They had plenty of exposed skin, but they weren't all the time scratching and slapping at the mosquitoes. Tuke showed him what to do. When the Indians would kill a bear, they would boil the bear grease down until it made a thick salve. Mixing it with some crushed herbs, they made their own bug repellent. If you smeared your skin with it, the mosquitoes left you alone. So Dr. Woodward decided if he was going to live with the Indians, he would live like the Indians. And he stripped right down to nothing but his undershorts. And then Tuke made him one of those little cloth things called the breech cloth to go around his middle, and he smeared his whole body with the bear grease and the herbs, and soon he was just as comfortable as any Indian chief. In fact, wearing little clothing was a lot better in the hot climate. It was very uncomfortable to be dressed in wool from head to toe. Tuke also taught her husband how to speak the Cusabo language, and she had an excellent method. Every afternoon, Tuke would build a fire and she would cook something in her pot. And then when Dr. Woodward came home from exploring in the woods, he would sit down and Tuke would say in the Cusabo language to him, "Now, white husband, tell me, what is the name of this food in the pot? Say it in the Cusabo way." And Dr. Woodward would have to guess what that was called. Soon enough, he was learning all kinds of Cusabo vocabulary. One afternoon, Dr. Woodward came home from exploring all day, and he was hot and tired and plenty hungry. He came into the hut and he plopped down next to his Indian wife. He could see right away in the pot over the fire was boiling venison stew, deer meat soup. He was so hungry he forgot all about the game. He grabbed up a wooden spoon, he started to scoop up some soup, and Tuke grabbed the spoon out of his hand and she said, No, white husband. Remember our game. Tell me in the Cusabo way, what do we call this soup?" Dr. Woodward couldn't remember for the life of him. He knew it was venison stew, but he couldn't think of the Cusabo word. And the more he thought, the more frustrated he became. Finally, he said, "Oh, Tuke, I don't want to play today. I'm hot and tired and plenty hungry. Let's just eat. I'll think of the word later." She snatched the spoon out of his hand and whacked him in the shoulder. "No, white husband, you must learn your Cusabo words." Henry Woodward was absolutely amazed. No English woman would strike her husband, but Tuke wasn't afraid of him. Finally, in frustration, he stood up and he said, "Fine, if you're not going to feed me, I'll go to the chief's house. Your uncle's wife, she has plenty of whatever she's cooking, and I'll eat some of that." And he started for the door. Tuke reached up and snatched his hat off of his head. It was the only thing from his former clothing that he continued to wear. Dr. Woodward said that he needed that big hat to protect his eyes from the hot sun. Tuke held up his prized hat and she picked up a sharp knife and she said, "White husband, if you don't sit down and learn your Cusabo words, I'll cut your hat into pieces, and then you won't have anything to shield your blue eyes, and won't you be sorry about that?" Henry thought she was bluffing, and so he turned and said, "Fine, cut up my hat. I don't even want it anymore." And he started for the door. This time she stuck the sharp knife right under his waist string and said, "White husband, if you take another step, I'll cut this string and your clothes will fall off, and then you'll have to walk to the chief's house naked. What do you think about that?" She had him there. Mr. Woodward had become very accustomed to living in the Indian manner, but not so accustomed that he was going to walk to the chief's house stark naked. So he sat down and he thought and he thought and he thought, and finally he burst out, "I know what that is!" And in Cusabo he said, "That is venison stew." And he and Tuke had a big, big laugh, and finally they were able to eat their supper. Many times after an evening meal, Dr. Woodward would go to the house of meeting and visit with the chief and his braves. The braves were very fond of smoking tobacco, and after they had had a good smoke, then they would start telling stories. The stories were sometimes not so believable. One Indian brave said to Dr. Woodward once, "You know what? A long time ago, when our fathers were not even born yet, our people were living in this village and visitors came from a far world, farther away than your world. These visitors were very strange. They had long tails sticking out their backsides. They looked like alligator tails, only they were hard and stiff. And whenever they wanted to sit down, we had to dig a hole so they could poke their tail down into the hole so they could sit upon the ground." Dr. Woodward had heard some amazing stuff, but he'd never heard that tale. And when he asked the Indian brave who told him, he said, "Is that true?" And the Indian brave just grinned and said, "It is just a story." Another brave spoke up and said, "Oh, I can tell you one better than that. I know something that you should write in your book." Dr. Woodward was all the time writing down information in his journals. "I know an herb that you can pick in the forest, and if you crush it up and rub it on your baby's skin, it will make your baby bones stretch, and you can stretch your baby out and help him grow into a giant. He'll be a great warrior, much bigger and taller than all of the other people." "Is that true?" And then all the braves would start to laugh, and finally one of them said, "Nah, it's just a story." But then the chief quieted all of his men, and he said, "Now, here is something that you need to know. In a village far away from here, there is another group called Westo. And the Westo, they are very dangerous. They have been into Florida, south of this place, and they have traded for guns from the Spanish. They are very wild. And when the Westo come here, if you hear their guns, you must run away. We always run. We only have bows and arrows. We cannot fight them. You must run." "Why do you fear the Westo so much?" asked Dr. Woodward. The chief looked very grave and shook his head, and all he would say was, "Westo, scori, scori Westo." That was a new Cusabo word that Dr. Woodward had never heard. He wanted to know what it meant. But all the braves and the chief just shook him off and would not speak about it. A few days later, Dr. Woodward was deep in the forest when he heard gunfire. He quickly ran to the village, and he saw that all of his Indian friends and family had gathered on the river bank. A ship was coming up the river from the harbor. He thought he had heard the gun firing of the Westos, but it actually was a cannon booming from that ship. Oftentimes when traders came to the Indian village, they would boom the big cannon as a signal, kind of like ringing a doorbell, to let the Indians know they were there to trade. The Indians had all run to the river, but this was a Spanish ship from St. Augustine, Florida. And Spanish soldiers came off the ship, they marched right up onto the beach, and they started to scan the faces of all the Indians looking at them. And then they pointed at Dr. Woodward and they said, "You are no Indian. We've heard that you're living here. This is Spanish territory, and you're coming with us." And they clapped Dr. Woodward in iron chains and drug him off to their ship, as if he were a slave. Dr. Woodward tried to reassure his Indian friends that he would return for them. Somehow he would escape. But they never saw him again. He lived as a prisoner in St. Augustine for a good while. And when he was finally able to escape, he went back to Barbados and eventually returned with the first group of settlers to a new colony, one they would call Carolina, in honor of the king who had granted them land in the New World. But when they arrived at Port Royal and found the Cusabo village, the whole place had been burned to the ground. They searched for several days, At last they found a few braves hiding in the woods, and when they questioned them, they would only say, "Westo, Scori." There was that word again. But they would not speak further about it. The settlers were so frightened by all of these events that they decided to sail well north of that area and build a little town in another natural harbor that came to be known as Charlestowne. And Dr. Woodward went with them. He never knew what happened to his wife Tukay. He assumed that she had been killed by the Westo. And so he married an English woman, had children, settled in Charlestown. But one afternoon, some of the other English settlers came to him and they said, "There are some Indians at your plantation. They're asking for you by name. They are Westos." And so Dr. Woodward stopped what he was doing and he hurried back to his own home from the village, and he met with the Westo warriors. And the Westos said, "We've heard of you. You are an English tradesman, and our chief sent us on a far journey. We want to trade with you. We no longer want to buy guns from the Spanish. We want to do business with you, but you must come and meet our chief." And Dr. Woodward said, "I could arrange that, yes, but tell me, when I used to live with the Cusabo, they would always say, 'Westo, Scori.' What does that mean?" And the brave smiled and said, "Ah, it means cannibal. If we don't like you, we will kill you and eat you. Now you come with us and meet our chief."